Every one of us needs food on the table and a roof over our heads, and for that we need jobs and a functioning economy. Tonight we'll talk about how we might get there. I'm Perry Strathern, and welcome to the second of 5 episodes of this Fairfax Media federal election debate. With me in the studio are Family First Senator Bob Day, Labor MP Nick Champion, our Liberal Senator Anne Ruston, Senator Nick Xenophon, and Greens Senator Robert Sims. Thank you for joining us. Let's look at the big picture first. What can a federal government do to keep the economy ticking over? I'm interested in hearing from you, Mr Champion.
Well, I suppose the old adage, first do no harm, is a good adage to live by. And what we've seen the Abbott and then Turnbull government do is to refuse $1 billion in investment in General Motors Holdings and basically goad them into leaving. We've seen huge recklessness around ships and submarines and the winding down of a very valuable and skilled shipbuilding workforce here in South Australia. And of course we've seen the real inaction in terms of our steel industry, where the Leader of the Opposition has written numerous times, as late ago as about 7 or 8 months ago now, to Malcolm Turnbull urging a bipartisan program to basically assist the steelworks. So what we've seen for South Australia is pretty grim in terms of this government's stewardship of the economy. And the reason is because they've had 2 Prime Ministers, 2 Treasurers, 3 Defence Ministers, 14 other ministerial changes. And while you've got all that chaos and inter-party fighting going on, you can't govern for South Australians. So that old adage of first do no harm should be the byword of every political party, but it weighs particularly heavily on the Abbott and Turnbull government.
And after doing no harm, you obviously believe in intervention from the government, support for industries as something that we should be looking at?
Well, I think government can make prudent co-investments. Certainly we could have done that in terms of Holden. And if we had done that in Holden's case, what we would have found is the dollar has gone from $1.05 to about 75 cents or so, and we would have been exporting cars from the Holden's factory into the US police car market and into the US performance car market. That's what would have happened. It would have been a story of renewal rather than decline.
I can see Bob Day disagreeing next to you.
No, I do disagree. That's the whole point. What can governments do? That's the point. They can't do anything because they don't know. I think Bert Kelly, the former member for Wakefield, once said, look, if governments knew how to do these things and knew how to pick favourites and knew how to pick winners, then they wouldn't be in government. They'd be sitting in the south of France with their feet in a bucket of champagne. The whole point of government and our Family First's approach is to get the government off your back and out of your pocket, so that people who actually do know how to run a business and run an economy can get on and do the things that they know will benefit themselves, their families, their business and their communities.
Do you agree with that, Senator Ruston?
Well, I certainly agree with that a whole heap more than I agree with what Mr Champion's just said. But I think absolutely the most fundamental thing that a government can do is to set the framework so that industry can prosper and the economy can grow, and then we should just plainly get out of the way. But I can't let go by this constant reference to GMH. I mean, Mike Devereaux, the head of GMH, made it very clear when GMH made the decision that they were going to exit Australia, that they were making that, they'd made that decision anyway, and there was nothing that any government would have been able to do to be able to change that. So unless we were intending to throw billions and billions and billions of dollars over the forward into GMH to try and keep that industry here, I think the reality was it was always going to go. And we do need to be sensible about when it comes time to transition out of some of our older industries into the new economy, into the innovative economy, and there's fantastic opportunities out there for innovation. We have to be realistic about how we spend the taxpayers' dollar. And the other point that I would make is $85 billion investment in naval shipbuilding in this country is no small thing. And for the Labor Party to be sitting here and lecturing us about our naval shipbuilding program, when in the whole time that they were in government they delivered not 1 ship for Australia, the only ships they did was 12 small vessels that they sent to Spain, I think seems a little hypocritical.
Senator Xenophon, how do you think we should be spending our money?
Let's talk about General Motors Holden first, because when GMH decided to leave this country in December 2013, it actually led to a collapse of the whole automotive supply chain. Now, I knew Mike Devereaux quite well. I think Nick Champion would have known him quite well. He was keen to stay in this country. The day before Joe Hockey's reckless announcement, he was actually at the Productivity Commission giving evidence saying, we want to stay, we want a plan, we can make this happen. Then we had the announcement by Mr Hockey and ably assisted by Warren Trust, The next day, General Motors in Detroit said, "Nah, we don't want any more of this." It was reckless. It was the wrong thing to do. And all I'm saying is that we now have a crisis of manufacturing jobs in this country. Anne's right, there should have been shipbuilding contracts signed earlier, but for the life of me, why didn't we, with the supply ships, at least have the modules built here in Australia? Why was the icebreaker tendered only for an overseas tender without local content? Because we can and should build our ships here, and that will mean loss of many hundreds of jobs. And our steel industry, we lose Arium in this country, you can kiss manufacturing goodbye in this country. That's why it is so critical. And I just want to have one, and this is a backhanded compliment to Bob Day. Bob Day came into the Senate from a long history as a home builder, and I've got to say this, Bob, I mean it genuinely, a terrific reputation. His building company housed thousands of people, employed many thousands of people. I thought that the first homeowners grant, which was a degree of government intervention in the home building industry, was a good thing. And so, Bob, there is a role for government to play.
No, it wasn't actually.
It wasn't a good thing?
No, all it did was drive up prices. It just stimulated more demand.
Well, you didn't say no to it at the time, did you?
Well, I did, but, the Industry Association, people get a handout, but they're the kind of demand stimulators. Okay. And it's another debate, but
I was making the point, you've got a terrific reputation as a home builder, but I thought that there is a role for government intervention, targeted government intervention at times.
Very quickly before we move on.
Absolutely. Look, I agree with Senator Xenophon. There is a role for government, and fundamentally in terms of how we manage our economy, budgets should be about fairness. They should reflect the priorities of the country. And of course, as part of that, you need to invest in critical public infrastructure, health, education, aged care. These are the kind of things that should be fundamental priorities of government, and they should be made available to all Australians, irrespective of where they live. I do want to also address this issue about the automotive industry. I absolutely agree with the comments that Senator Xenophon has made, but also Mr Champion. We do need to take action to protect manufacturing jobs here in South Australia. And that's one of the reasons that when I first began my term in the Senate, put a bill before Parliament to provide assistance to manufacture electric cars here in South Australia. That's a great opportunity for us to do something for the environment, to take action on climate change, but also to use the skills and experience of our state's manufacturing industry to create green cars. And we should have a part of every green car around the world being manufactured right here in South Australia. That's an example of the kind of vision that we could be seeing from Canberra, but we're not seeing it under this Turnbull government.
We'll move along and I'll explain why. We've talked about cars and ships, obviously, which are drivers of economic activity across South Australia. But in country areas, particularly in regional centres like Whyalla and Port Augusta, we very often have one industry towns where if that single industry gets in trouble, it can have a huge flow-on effect, not just for that town, but for the whole region around it. What can the federal government do for towns like Whyalla, for towns like Port Augusta and regional centres when they falter? Senator Sims.
Well, the first thing they can do in Port Augusta is invest the $100 million that's needed to get the solar thermal plant off the ground. There's huge community support for that project, and there's a huge opportunity for us here in South Australia, but we need support from the Liberals to make that happen. And in terms of supporting Whyalla Steel and local steel manufacturing, we can do that by ripping up the TPP and having local procurement policies. Because at the moment we have policies in place that actually sell off the national interest to interests overseas, and we're seeing the impacts of that in regional communities. I was in Whyalla recently for the Senate inquiry into steel here in Australia, and it's very clear that people in those local communities are feeling the pinch in terms of the impact of government policies and the consensus in Canberra between Labor and the Liberals that is selling out jobs. So in terms of new opportunities, invest in renewables, but also let's have a different approach to our economic system.
The Greens would like support on solar thermal.
Well, the facts of the matter are that on Monday this week we had a company come out and say that with the assistance of the RET and with the supply contract being provided by the South Australian Government for agreed to purchase their electricity, they would proceed with a solar thermal plant using graphite as a storage mechanism without any further support from government at all. And I think that probably demonstrates about the way that the triggers are working. In addition, towns like Whyalla, I was in Whyalla yesterday and the day before, there is no doubt that there has been a very major impact in that community from not just the recent recent comments or the recent decisions by and receivership, but this is something that's been going on in Whyalla.
Administration or receivership?
Yeah, sorry, administration. But this has been going on for a long time. You know, this didn't happen overnight. But the one thing that is sure, and that is it only will be a majority government that is able to assist the ongoing activities of whatever Arrium transitions into over the next little while. We're waiting for the final findings of KordaMentha as to what the future, the possible future for Arrium is likely to be. And then we have to sit down as a majority government and work out how we are able to assist them.
One thing government should not be doing is promoting job-destroying activities like wind farms. They've driven up the price of electricity in South Australia, putting enormous pressure on businesses. One of the reasons that there's a job crisis in Whyalla and Port Augusta is because of these infernal wind farms.
That is nonsense.
They make absolutely no benefit for the environment. They affect people's health, and they're destroying South Australia's
That's completely
competitiveness.
untrue.
And we really need to. One of the examples why governments should not be forcing and mandating that people buy this inefficient electricity called wind farm generation.
We'll have an interesting talk about the environment later this week, I can see. But for now, Mr. Champion, what do you think?
Well, it sounds like Bob's pining for the 1930s economy to me. I mean, I think he sort of, wants to look back with a rosy view on some of these things. But look, what I'd say is, in particular steel making, we can institute Australian standards for Australian projects. We can toughen anti-dumping rules. And government as a procurer can look at the market power it has in government-funded projects, infrastructure projects to purchase Australian-made steel. And we can do things like lowering the thresholds for Australian industry plans for private projects from 500 million to 250 million and for public tenders from 20 million to 10 million. All of that, along with a few other administrative mechanisms, can actually provide a pretty good basis for the steel making to go forward. The other thing I think we do have to look at is sensible co-investment, but that should be done frankly on a bipartisan basis, because we don't want a situation where we have a bidding war between any of the political parties. That's not in the interest of the public. What we do want is a firm bipartisan basis for going forward with the administrator in this instance. That's one of the reasons why we wrote 8 months ago to the Prime Minister, Bill Shorten, very interested in the steel industry. I think that we could have a good national solution to the steel industry, but we've got to have a bit of goodwill between the parties, and we've got to have a bit of good sense in dealing with the administrator.
Can I just chip in of the accusation that I want to go back to the 1930s? I don't. We've got LNG, there's nuclear. They didn't have LNG power plants in the 1930s, nor did they have nuclear power plants. Just wanted to clarify that.
Open to some new options.
Okay,
certainly.
thank you.
Senator Xenophon, what can we do for struggling
Okay,
towns?
well, I have to leap forward 80 years, I think.
We're time travellers here.
So, look, we have a real situation. We have a real crisis of manufacturing in this country. Whyalla, the steelworks must be saved. That is something that Andrea Broadfoot, the candidate for the Nick Xenophon team, is campaigning incredibly hard on, and we need to drive a hard bargain and a fair bargain to make sure those steelworks work and thrive and prosper. Greater energy efficiency, government procurement rules that insist on buying Australian first on the basis of the social and economic benefits in relation to buying Australian first. And if the Commonwealth government is giving billions of dollars to the states for infrastructure projects, they need to insist that there is a buy Australian first policy in relation to that. And in our dumping rules, Nick Champion is right. They have been woeful. I put up a bill on that about 5 years ago. The Labor government, to its credit, picked up on some of those mechanisms. That's what Brendan O'Connor said at the time, to improve it, but we need to go much further. This is not about protectionism. This is about making sure we look after our national interest.
And I'll stay with you, if we may, for our next question. One key part of Australia's future is the national broadband network. I'd just like to ask each of you, do you think that the NBN will be fast enough, soon enough for our needs, and just as importantly, can we afford it?
Well, I think it's a question of can we not afford it, in the sense that if we don't, we should do it right. we should get it right. I thought initially when Malcolm Turnbull rolled out the fibre to the node plan, I thought that maybe that might work. I didn't say much about it at the time, but it now seems that it hasn't worked. And what I find very interesting is a few weeks ago, Senator Stephen Conroy's offices and one of his staffers were raided by the AFP, by the Federal Police. The Federal Police were doing their job. I'm not suggesting in any way any political interference. But our official secrets laws need to change in this country, because if a public servant has leaked documents that are in the public interest in relation to material that we need to know about, then that public servant and the journalists that receive that shouldn't be facing a 2-year jail term.
Senator Ruston, back on the NBN, are we doing it right so far?
Look, I mean, you make a very good point in your introduction. It's about what is actually affordable. What we have sought to do on two fronts. One is that we sought, when we came into government, with an NBN, I might say that it made a whole heap of promises and delivered on very few of them. We had very few homes connected and very short, very low levels of rollout. However, what we sought to do when we got there was actually to change the way that we were rolling the NBN out, to actually address the people who had the least connectivity or no connectivity first, instead of just trying to work on the areas of greatest activity, so that we could get a quicker return on investment. We changed it around and said those people that had the worst or none would get it first. So it's a balance between affordability and being able to get it out there as quickly as we possibly can to those people that need it the most. But I noticed that now that the SkyMaster satellites have, they ran a test on SkyMaster, the new satellite that replaced the interim satellites, with a household that was running Netflix and doing Skype at the same time, and had no impact at all on the quality of the reception that they were getting. So obviously our new satellites are really important for our rural and regional communities, particularly those that don't have any access to any other types of NBN. So look, everyone would like to spend an absolute fortune and put a gold-plated system out there, but the reality is that we can't spend what we don't have.
I'll go quickly to Bob Day.
Once again, this is what happens when governments create a monopoly. Family First supports an NBN, everybody does, and the overseas experience of how important national broadband networks are. But when governments get involved, create a monopoly, as always, it takes too long and it costs too much.
Nick Champion?
Well, I just think it's a ridiculous proposition. You have to provide some services through a monopoly system. That's the only way you get a national broadband network. What Bob's talking about is a series of private networks which would institute a digital divide. A digital divide that the government is instituting by going back to the old copper network. Now, if you take the town of Gawler, half the town is on fibre, that was Labor. The other half is on these old copper networks, and if you look in any of these pits or talk to any of the old Telstra linesmen, they'll tell you that the copper network is knackered. After 50 years, it is, it's buggered. So let's not pretend that you can do it on the cheap with the copper network. That's what will take us from the 30th fastest in the world to the 60th fastest. That's where we are today. That's what will blow out costs by 1,300%. If you try and do this on the cheap, it'll cost more money, not less. If you do it properly with fibre, you'll get the job done and you'll have an equal society.
Yeah, I also have to challenge this idea of, somehow privatising this is going to improve the outcome. I mean, I think people, particularly living in the regions, would see the impact of privatisation of core utilities firsthand. It hasn't been good for service delivery, and something like the NBN is a critical service for people here in Australia, in particular living in the regions, because as Nick said, we need to break down that digital divide. I was in the US a few years ago, and they've got an amazing speed in terms of their broadband network, and it really brought home to me just how far Australia is lagging behind. And really, it's an example, I think, of a failure from Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, he's been the Minister of Communication who has foreseen this complete fiasco, and as Prime Minister he's failed to put it right. And I think people in regional South Australia that I'm talking to want to see this rolled out, and they want to see access to appropriate broadband connection.
Well, let's hope that our viewers' internet connection is keeping up with this series of videos.
Hopefully it's not buffering.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. Tomorrow we'll be talking about an industry that has always been central to country life, which is agriculture. Join us at 7:30 p.m. on your local Fairfax website and social media channels. For now, good night.